Today's NES nostalgia tripping list is more than commonly heavy on sport games for no apparent reason, and we might as well start with one of them. This one is a tennis game called Racket Attack. Originally released by Jaleco in Japan and United States in 1988, but for some reason it didn't reach Europe until 1994. Even so, I had never even heard of Racket Attack until I bought the game in 2001, but I will get back to that in a minute. I never really played it too much because Nintendo's own tennis was available and it was much simpler and more entertaining. If you do like a more evolved tennis game though, Racket Attack does offer various different players to choose from, all with their own strengths. After selecting your player, you choose the court from clay, grass and hard options. While the game does feel more thoroughly designed than Nintendo's tennis, the one real problem I have with Racket Attack is the moving action camera, which is slightly zoomed in from the usual view, and it follows the ball in an uneven manner rather than your player. Sure, it's an uncommon feature, but it also ruins an otherwise perfectly good tennis game. The nostalgia I have for this one has more to do with how I got this game rather than actually about playing it. The year was 2001, as I said, and I had moved away from my old home to my current hometown no more than a few months before I came across this game, and I found it from one of the local hypermarkets, as they're called, still shrink-wrapped with a price tag of 10 marks for it, which, in the way of the currencies were back then, would have been less than 2 euros. Yeah, we were still living with our own currency at that point, but more to the point, I thought it was remarkable that they even had some NES games still for sale in the hypermarket. They had one or two other games with a slightly higher price tag, but I had them already in my collection, so I didn't bother wasting my money on them. Anyway, Racket Attack was the last NES game that I purchased while Finland still had its own currency, which is why it is truly a nostalgia game for me. The rest of the episode can be considered more or less proper NES classics, and our next item is the newest one of the bunch, Kirby's Adventure from 1993. This might actually be one of my top 3 platforming games on the NES, easily surpassing at least one of the Super Mario Bros. Games, if not 2 on a good day. By 1993, of course, the Super Nintendo had already been around for a couple of years, making the development of new games for the 8-bit console less profitable. But Nintendo kept releasing new games for the Famicom and NES until 1994, with Kirby's first sequel to the Game Boy's Kirby's Dream Land being one of the last proper 8-bit classics. You might have seen Kirby's Dream Land featured in one of the Game Boy episodes of my Nostalgia Trip games, in which case you know the basics. Kirby does have some new abilities though, such as running and slide kicking, but most importantly, Kirby can inhale and swallow enemies to copy their abilities now, which was really what made Kirby such a cool character to me when I first encountered it by playing Kirby's Adventure on emulation almost 30 years ago now. In terms of structure, Kirby's Adventure feels closer to Super Mario World than either the earlier Kirby game or the Super Mario Bros. Games on the NES, but the copy ability makes Kirby's Adventure feel even more different each time you play it, depending on how you decide to play it. Somehow I managed to play Kirby's Adventure as an original cartridge during the late 90s, but the game ended up into my personal collection as the Japanese original after I had bought myself a video modded Famicom a few years ago. Definitely one of the must-play games for the 8-bit Nintendo, and a must-have also if you're a collector. Konami's output on the NES was probably about as important for the console's worldwide success as Nintendo's own efforts were, so we've got 3 Konami games on the list today, starting with another one of the platforming classics, Bucky O'Hare from 1992. The format of the game is largely similar to DuckTales and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, with some Contra-like elements thrown here and there, and even something from Sunsoft's Batman game. You get to choose a character mid-play to use their specific special abilities to your advantage, although Bucky himself is really the central character to success. It is a properly well-executed platforming action-adventure game, just what you would have come to expect from Konami around this time. Believe it or not, I hadn't heard of this game until maybe about 15 years ago, when I got it from a bundle of NES games from a longtime gaming colleague SJ, who was getting rid of some of his old gear. I did play the game soon afterwards, and managed to even complete it in a couple of days. Until the making of this episode, however, I had no idea what was the story behind the character. And Wikipedia says, Bucky O'Hare was a comic book character created between 1977 and 78, and his adventures were first published in 1984. The appearance of Bucky O'Hare and the whole set of characters and the setup reminds me heavily of Nintendo's Star Fox series, with every character being an animal of some sort and everything happening in space. I still haven't really dug up any further on that front, but Bucky O'Hare did have an animated series aired between September 1991 and January 1992, during which Konami produced 2 tie-in games based on the IP, this one and another one for the arcades, both released the same year. Despite of your highly probable lack of knowledge and connection to the original source material, I can safely say that Bucky O'Hare is a fully enjoyable game with Konami written all over it. Going back to my music studying days, I was introduced to a neat little puzzle game called Adventures of Lolo, which back then felt like it could have been made in the mid-80s. To be fair, as I found out much later on, Lolo's earlier adventure, Eggerland, from the MSX, was released in 1985, and this one just continued with largely the same design. The idea is to collect these cards with a heart in the middle of them to open up a chest somewhere in the room, which holds a pearl you must collect in order to open up the exit to the next area. You can push certain blocks to open and close pathways, which can also be helpful in keeping some enemies out of your reach. Basically, it's Sokoban and Repton or Boulder Dash combined, but cuter. There's a ton and a few levels to get through, and it's just repeating the same idea over and over with the usual climb in difficulty, which might easily keep you occupied for a good while if you're a puzzle fan. It has to be said though that HAL Laboratories games have always been highly addicting and well crafted, even if their visual style hasn't always been the most impressive. We have seen this as much on the C64 and MSX as on the Nintendo consoles, but it also has to be said, the Kirby games were originally designed and written by HAL Laboratory, so their sense of style draws every possible advantage from simple designs and makes them live like some more difficult designs are unable to. Adventures of Lolo is just another example of HAL Laboratory at their best, albeit in a completely different way than the Kirby games. Still, I can only recommend this one, but particularly so if you're a puzzle fan. Sports game number 2 for this episode is Nintendo's own NES Open Tournament Golf from 1991, which I suppose is Nintendo's answer to Sega's 1990 game Golfamania, which I have featured in the series earlier. Being a Nintendo game, you get your usual Mario appearance, which back in the day might have been enough to draw in some Mario fan kids, even if golf is not considered to be the most universally interesting game. However, the amount of features in NES Open goes well past what you got in Golfamania, and the animated cutscenes make the game more lively and impressive than most 8-bit golf games ever released. Too bad NES Open isn't designed as the most intuitive golf game, because the many features do make it more flexible as to how you're able to play it. For me, NES Open was one of those games I saw in TV commercials before I ever had any proper experience on the console myself, but I didn't get to play it until emulation came along. To be brutally honest, the game looked more impressive in the ads than it did when I actually got to play it, so it took a while for me to get comfortable with it. The other NES golf game I used to play some amount was Nintendo's earlier golf game, simply titled Golf, from 1984, but I decided to choose NES Open for this list instead because it is the better one of the two, and has the tiny bit more nostalgia for me thanks to those early 90s commercials. My short list of nostalgia-tripping role-playing games for the NES can pretty much be counted on a single hand's fingers. Today's entry from that genre is Crystalis from SNK 1990. Like the two Legend of Zelda games and Star Tropics, Crystalis shares one important gameplay feature with them: real-time combat. For the longest time, this was an absolute necessity for me in role-playing games if I was to give the game any attention. The backstory in Crystalis goes like this. A thermonuclear war began on October the 1st, 1997, which basically made the whole of humanity go medieval, now to coexist with all sorts of mutated creatures. Science and technology are replaced by magic, but an evil conqueror by the name of Dragon has been secretly combining magic with technology in his ambitions of taking over the entire world. An unnamed hero wakes up from cryogenic sleep to fight this evil with help from a female accomplice, Mija, and 4 sages who will help you learn magical spells and information about your quest. It's an epic journey to be sure, and although I did enjoy playing Crystalis for as long as I did pre-2000, my progress was halted by lack of attention back then. Replaying it has always been on my mind whenever I get the feel to start something longer term on the NES, but since I actually haven't bought it into my collection yet, I haven't caught the obsession bad enough. Putting the game in this episode got me instantly drawn into it again. Although the unfortunate fact remains, there is only so much time you can put into any certain thing at a time. But I can still heartily recommend this game to anyone with the inclination to invest a good amount of time and effort into it. One of Konami's flagship games, Contra, or Probotector as it was known here in Europe, was a bigger series than some people care to remember. Personally, my own experiences with the Contra series were limited to the original game on various platforms, the Super Nintendo Contra game, and to a lesser extent, the second game, Super C, or whatever it was called in any of the 3 main regions it was released in. Sure, I did try out some other games, but somehow none of them held my notice as much as these 3 did. The basic structure of Super Contra is largely similar to the other Contra games, with the game starting with a side-scrolling run-and-gun section, and then moving on to some other style, usually singular to the particular game in question. With the first Contra, you get the tunnels. Contra 3 on the Super NES gives you the top-down mazes, and with Super Contra, you get vertically scrolling overhead segments, as in Commando and such. This, I suspect, is what makes Super Contra less memorable than the other early Contra games, because it offers nothing specifically Contra-style special stages. However, the level designs are still top-notch, and the challenge is exactly what you would expect from a Contra game. My first encounter with Super Contra was in the early days of emulation, of course, when I started digging into the NES library with my friend, gaming colleague SJ, so I thought it was only proper to get his help on the multiplayer footage here again. Since Probotector 2 is such a rare item these days, the game originally found its way into my collection some 10 years ago as part of one of those funky little pirate multicards that feature 3 other somewhat big titles from the same period, which I think is suitable enough. I don't think it's nearly as classic as the original or the Super NES Contra game, but it's still a good one to play if you're a fan of the series. The only representative from the early Famicom days we have today is Nintendo's Wrecking Crew, originally released in Japan in 1984. As with many of these early Famicom games, my introduction to this one came through one of those pirate multicards, although I can't say for sure when and where exactly I came across this one for the first time. For probably the first time ever, Mario, or Luigi if you're playing in 2-player mode, takes on an extracurricular job as a wrecker of structures. If you're into swinging a wrecking ball to smash all sorts of buildings, Wrecking Crew might be something of a disappointment since you just walk around small vertically extending areas and hit brick walls and other such structures with your hammer, including those metal reinforced ladders, until there are no such items to break anymore. As with most Mario games, there are some enemies around, but in this game there is no way to dispose of them. Instead, avoidance is your only option. To help with that, The game uses a similar wraparound technique as used in Nintendo's earlier Popeye and Mario Bros. Games. A potentially fun bonus thing in Wrecking Crew is a level editor, which gives you the chance to get to design and play your own levels. But unfortunately for us non-Japanese folks, the level editor was only designed to use the Famicom data recorder, an actual cassette drive for the Famicom if you've never heard of such a thing, as a means to save and load your custom levels. Well, actually, this feature was properly featured again in the Wii Virtual Console release, using the Wii's own system storage to act as the storage medium. Good luck getting that working anymore. Anyway, Wrecking Crew is one of those more fun and interesting Mario-themed arcade games, and relatively easy to find too. The game's success in the country of origin was apparently higher than elsewhere because it also had a Japan-only sequel for the Super Nintendo in 1998. For the longest time, the most noteworthy game that evaded my attention was none other than Metroid. Yes, the genre-defining platforming action-adventure game with the famous surprise ending that shook the whole gaming world with the revelation of Now, Metroid was one of the first games I ever tried to play on an NES, as one of my childhood neighbors had it. Not being an NES gamer at that point, I had no idea what Metroid was about, and the way the game started didn't really impress me in any way. But then I didn't really get anywhere in it back then. When I eventually got to try Metroid with more purpose and intention through emulation in the late 90s, the beginning of the game did get me slightly intrigued with the structure and how your character got some interesting abilities by collecting things. However, I didn't exactly grow to enjoy the original Metroid at that point either. The claustrophobic feel of the environment, coupled with a similarly irritatingly samey overall look of the area that most Spectrum-originated isometric games suffer from, was something that just kept putting me off. Super Metroid on the Super Nintendo was a much more instantly likable game, but I didn't even play that one properly until many years later. Fast forward to maybe 2005 or 2006, which is when I think I've found one of the most prominent, highly rated and successful games of a subgenre of games that would be labeled as Metroidvania. The game in question was Cave Story, which I loved instantly and finished at least 3 times since then. Back then I didn't completely understand the connection to Metroid or even Castlevania because there was so much more to it, and Cave Story played so much better than either Metroid or Castlevania. Anyway, this was my first step towards understanding the hype behind Metroid, and I will probably be talking about this Cave Story in a later DOS episode. Now the next step would take an even longer while with the release of a more straightforward but upgraded Metroid clone called Axiom Verge, which I played a few years ago to completion, followed by its sequel the year after. This prompted me to finally start playing Super Metroid properly, and not too long afterwards, the original NES Metroid. Now I'm happy to say I finally understand the game, although I still can't say I enjoyed nearly as much as the Super Nintendo sequel. But all this had to happen to reach the eventual conclusion. It has been about 35 years between my first awkward contact with the original Metroid and actually buying the game into my collection, and my awkward beginning with the game all that time ago makes it a true nostalgia trip game for me. And now, the last one for this episode is one of the first games I ever saw on a TV advertisement promoting NES games, Track and Field 2. Originally released as Konami Sports in Seoul in Japan in 1988 by Konami, and elsewhere as the title says here in 1989. And this is not to be confused with a similarly titled game on the MSX, which is why the Japanese title would be more logical to use. Oddly enough, no one in my area of childhood had this game in their unavoidably meager NES collections, even though it was supposedly a big game at the time, so my first actual experience of Track and Field 2 came through emulation. Obviously, I have it now in my collection, but it took me until last year to actually get it. The memory of seeing this game's events in that late 80s commercial is peculiarly strong, and I think there were at least a few other games featured in that TV ad, such as Rad Racer, Metroid, and probably Super Mario Bros. I believe the event they used in that ad was either triple jump or pole vault, because it had a large athlete running in the middle of the screen, but since I haven't found the advert since then, it's hard to say. Anyway, Track and Field 2 is, for all that my word is worth, the most impressive and probably the most important multi-event sports game ever released for the 8-bit Nintendo. Not only because it was such a huge leap in terms of content from the original Track and Field, but also because it was the first athletic sports game to actually give some competition to Epic's sports games on the 8-bit computers, with epic opening and closing ceremonies and other such little things between events. Also, before this game, most arcade and NES sport games had featured a selection of the usual decathlon events, and it was mostly a button-smashing marathon. Here, you get events that require skill, timing, and precision more than speed and dexterity, such as 3 shooting events, 2 fighting events, fencing and taekwondo, and canoeing, amongst the more traditional athletic events. And of course, this being a Konami game from the late 80s, the soundtrack is needlessly epic, and the graphics are more awesome than most things you had seen on the NES thus far. Konami really were at the top of their game here, and through their catalog, it's easy to see why the NES eventually came to be the huge success that it was. For NES enthusiasts, I would say Track and Field 2 is not only highly recommended, but essential. Oddly enough, it feels like a game that should be played on a joystick instead of the usual NES gamepad.